Stowaway on the dark ship. As the sun set on the Isle of Undead Androids, Redbeard and his crew prepared to set sail on the Ariadne's Fury. The clear sky and strong tailwinds promised a swift and uneventful journey home. Gazelle stood on the deck, watching as the silent isle disappeared into the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and she couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the dark mage they had left behind. Redbeard approached her, his rough hand gently taking hers. "Don't worry, sister," he said with a smile. "We've done all we can. The rest is in the hands of the goddess." Gazelle smiled back at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I know," she said. "But I can't help but feel that our work is far from over. The shadows grow longer every day, and I fear that the threat of the Dark Mages is greater than we could ever imagine." Redbeard squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with understanding. "Then we'll face whatever comes our way, together," he said. "We'll be a force to be reckoned with, sister. You and me, and the rest of the sisters. We'll keep fighting, no matter what." The return journey from the Isle of Undead Androids on the ship Ariadne's Fury began with clear skies, but it wasn't long before the weather began to turn. A storm started to rise, bringing with it high winds and rough seas. As the storm raged on, the crew of the Ariadne's Fury struggled to keep the ship afloat. The cargo shifted in the rough seas, damaging the hull and making it difficult to make repairs. When they tried to fix the damage, they were hit with an electrical shock that knocked out their tools and left them at the mercy of the storm. As the storm raged on, the Ariadne's Fury began to slowly sink. The crew knew that there were not enough spaces on the lifeboats for everyone, and a desperate discussion broke out. Redbeard, as the captain, knew that it was his duty to stay behind and go down with the ship. "I can't believe this is happening," cried Jack, the first mate. "We've come so far, and now we're going to drown barely a day's journey from shore." "We can't give up yet," said Redbeard, his voice steady. "We have to try and make repairs and ride out the storm. But if it comes to it, we'll have to abandon ship." As the crew frantically tried to save the ship, Redbeard took a moment to speak with Gazelle. "I'm sorry it has to end like this," he said, taking her hand. "I never expected to fall in love on this journey, but I'm grateful for every moment we had together." Gazelle's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd find love either," she said. "But I'm glad I found it with you. I'll never forget you, Redbeard." As the water rose and the ship creaked and groaned, Redbeard knew it was time to say goodbye. He kissed Gazelle one last time, and then turned to the crew. "It's time to go," he said, his voice cracking. "May the winds be at your back, and may we meet again in the beyond." As the crew scrambled onto the lifeboat and quickly assembled rafts, Redbeard stood on the deck of the Ariadne's Fury, watching as the ship was swallowed by the waves. And as he went down with the ship, he knew that he had found both heaven and hell in Gazelle's arms, and that he would always be grateful for the time they had together. But as the Ariadne's Fury finally disappeared beneath the turbulent sea, Redbeard was thrown into the rough waters, the force of the sinking ship sending him flying. He struggled to stay afloat, the waves crashing over him as he fought to keep his head above water. Redbeard clung to the wreckage of the Ariadne's Fury, the rough sea tossing him about like a rag doll. He had been in the water for what felt like an eternity, his clothes and skin soaked through, his muscles aching from the effort of holding on. The waves crashed over him, drenching him in salt water and pulling him under. He gasped for air as he broke the surface, coughing and spluttering. He looked around, hoping to see land or a rescue ship on the horizon, but all he saw was an endless expanse of water. He knew he couldn't keep this up for much longer, but he refused to give up. He would find a way to survive, no matter what. He clenched his teeth and gritted his determination, holding on to the debris with all his strength as the storm raged on. As time passed, Redbeard's grip on the debris began to weaken. His arms and legs were numb from the cold water, and he could feel himself slipping in and out of consciousness. Just when he thought he could hold on no longer, he caught sight of land on the horizon. It was a faint glimmer, but it was enough to give him the strength to keep going. He kicked his legs and pulled himself closer to the shore, determined to survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he washed up on the sandy beach, barely conscious but alive. As the sun began to set, Redbeard slowly came to, his body aching and his head pounding. He looked around, taking in his surroundings. He was lying on a shore, surrounded by debris and flotsam. As he tried to sit up, he realized he was barely conscious and weak from his ordeal. He forced himself to his feet, taking in the sight before him. Redbeard was confused and disoriented as he looked upon the ruins of the long-abandoned civilization. He had thought he was floating aimlessly at sea, but now he found himself back on the Isle of Undead Androids. The dimming light of the day cast an eerie glow on the broken factories and tall, crumbling buildings that surrounded him. He couldn't understand how he had gotten here, but he knew he had to find shelter before nightfall. He searched through the debris and rubble, hoping to find some sort of shelter. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned around, but saw no one. He quickened his pace, hoping to find some place safe before the darkness overtook him. Redbeard was able to find shelter in an abandoned factory building, which, although in disrepair, provided enough protection from the elements for him to get some rest on the first night on the isle. He gathered some dry wood and started a small fire to warm himself and cook some of the berries he had found earlier. As he sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Despite his exhaustion, Redbeard stayed awake and vigilant, listening to the sounds of the night and keeping a close eye on his surroundings. As the next evening settled in, Redbeard found himself feeling drained and exhausted. He had spent the entire day searching for food and water, and his efforts had finally paid off when he stumbled upon a small stream with clear, cool water and a patch of wild berries. He sat down by the stream and drank his fill, savoring the sweet, juicy taste of the berries. Despite the eerie silence of the island, he managed to fall into a fitful sleep, dreaming of his lost crew and the beautiful sister gazelle. The next morning, Redbeard woke up feeling rested and rejuvenated. He had managed to find enough water and berries to sustain him, and he was grateful for the shelter provided by the ruins of the ancient civilization. As the days turned into weeks, Redbeard couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was keeping an eye on him. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger each day. One morning as Redbeard knelt down to drink from the clear spring water, he noticed something strange on the ground nearby. At first he thought it was just a rock or a piece of debris, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a boot print. But not just any boot print, this one was made by a metal boot. Redbeard immediately tensed and scanned his surroundings, his hand instinctively going to his sword, before he remembered that he had lost all of his weapons at sea. He knew that the Isle of Undead Androids was home to many dangerous creatures, and the presence of a metal boot could only mean one thing: an undead android was nearby. Redbeard knew he had to be careful, but he also knew he couldn't just sit and wait for the android to come to him. He had to take the fight to it. He silently rose to his feet and began to move cautiously through the ruins, his senses on high alert. Redbeard began to fortify his makeshift camp against any potential attacks from the undead android. He gathered sharp sticks and rocks to use as weapons, and built up a wall of debris and branches around the perimeter of the camp. He also set up a series of traps and alarms using strings and makeshift bells made from shells and bones. At night, Redbeard slept fitfully, his senses always alert for any sign of danger. He practiced his combat techniques, honing his skills and preparing for the day when he would have to face the android head-on. Despite his precautions, Redbeard couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He began to see glimpses of movement in the shadows, and heard strange noises that seemed to come from all around him. He knew that the android was out there, waiting and watching, biding its time until it could strike. Redbeard knew that he had to stay vigilant if he wanted to survive. He steeled his resolve and prepared for the day when the android would finally make its move. He had been on the island for weeks now, and had encountered no sign of any other living beings. But every night, he woke up to the same sensation: two glowing red eyes staring at him from the darkness. And every night, he heard the distant metallic sounds of something moving through the trees. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he had to be ready for anything. Despite the fear that gnawed at him, Redbeard was determined to survive on this island, no matter what it took. As Redbeard slowly woke up from his deep sleep, he was greeted with a shocking sight. Just 15 meters from his shelter, he saw something completely unexpected on a boulder. He couldn't believe his eyes as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His heart raced as he tried to comprehend the scene in front of him, his mind struggling to process the information. Upon closer inspection, he realized that it was the severed and decomposing head of Jack, his first mate. The sight was shocking and revolting, causing Redbeard's stomach to turn and his heart to race. Jack had always been a bright and energetic young man, full of life and enthusiasm. With a sharp wit and quick reflexes, he was a natural choice for first mate on the Ariadne's Fury. His rugged good looks and charming smile might have made him handsome, if not for the Glasgow smile that he had earned in a bar fight. Despite his rough exterior, Jack had a heart of gold and would do anything for his captain and crew. He had worked his way up through the ranks, proving himself time and time again with his loyalty and bravery. Redbeard had always had a soft spot for Jack, and the two had become fast friends over the years. All of a sudden, he felt a surge of adrenaline rush through his body as he realized the gravity of the situation. He could hardly believe that his friend and crewmate was gone, and that he had been left alone on the island. The boulder, surrounded by lush green bushes, seemed to be an altar-like resting place, but it was the grue, yet beautiful, sight of the decomposing and severed head of Jack that caused Redbeard to pause. He couldn't help but wonder if he was under immediate threat and if he should flee, but as he took a deep breath and calmed down, he realized that there was no movement or sounds around him. He couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness as he approached the boulder and paid his respects to his fallen comrade. Redbeard approached the boulder, his heart heavy with grief and shock. He stood before the stone, and looked upon the grisly sight. "Farewell, my old friend," Redbeard said softly, his voice choked with emotion. "I never would have thought that this would be your final resting place. But perhaps it is fitting, for you always were one for the grand gesture. I'll make sure to drink in your honor. You were a good man and a loyal companion. Rest easy, Jack. You will be missed." As Redbeard turned from the boulder where his first mate, Jack, rested, he noticed an undead android standing just a few feet away. The android's glowing red eyes seemed to bore into Redbeard's soul as they locked gazes. The two stood there for what felt like an eternity, each sizing the other up. Redbeard's heart pounded in his chest as he wondered if he was about to face his final battle. But ultimately, the android seemed content to simply stand and stare, as if it were waiting for something. As Redbeard stared at the undead android, he couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and disgust. The android was a twisted mockery of life, with its rusting metal frame and glowing red eyes. Redbeard knew that he was no match for the android in a physical fight, but he refused to back down. He looked into its glowing red eyes, searching for any sign of recognition or understanding. "What do you want from me?" Redbeard asked, his voice low and steady. "Did you put my friend on that altar? Was that your way of paying respects?" Redbeard couldn't shake the feeling that the android was trying to communicate with him, but he just couldn't decipher its intentions. He continued to stare at the android, waiting for some kind of response. Redbeard watched as the android turned and walked away, its metal boots clanking on the ground. He grabbed his makeshift knife and long, sharp stick that served as a spear, ready to defend himself if necessary. But something about the android's movement seemed peaceful and non-threatening. Redbeard decided to follow the android, keeping his distance and remaining cautious. He had no idea what the android wanted or why it had placed his friend's head on the altar-like boulder, but he was determined to find out. Redbeard cautiously followed the android through the ruins of the abandoned city. Redbeard couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia wash over him. He had been to this place before, many years ago. As Redbeard followed the android through the ruins, he suddenly caught a faint smell of fire in the air. He stopped for a moment, trying to determine the direction the smell was coming from. As he continued walking, he soon heard the sounds of human voices and the clanging of metal on metal, indicating the presence of a workshop nearby. The android stopped and seemed to hesitate, as if it was reluctant to go any closer. Redbeard, however, was drawn towards the sounds and decided to continue on his own. As Redbeard walked closer, he couldn't believe his eyes. There, in front of him, was a massive zeppelin hovering just above the ground. It was a sleek and formidable machine, with a long, pointed nose and a series of propellers attached to its hull. But it was the source of its power that truly caught Redbeard's attention. He could feel the dark magic emanating from the zeppelin, a palpable energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He knew that this was the work of the Dark Magus, and he knew that he should get as far away from it as possible. Redbeard watched from a distance as the Dark Magus loaded the zeppelin with android technology. They were efficient and precise, clearly well trained in their work. Redbeard couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sight of the massive airship, its dark hull seeming to absorb the light around it. He knew he had to get closer to see what was happening, but he was also cautious. He had no idea what the dark mages were capable of, and he didn't want to risk being caught. So he remained hidden in the shadows, observing from a safe distance. As Redbeard watched from a distance, he could see that the dark mages were busy at work. One of the mages, a tall, slender figure with dark hair and piercing eyes, seemed to be in charge. Redbeard recognized him immediately as Nefarian, the dark mage he had heard so much about. Nefarian and the other mages were gathered around a large android that was lying on the ground. They were fiddling with a gadget that was attached to the android's back, trying to get it to restart. However, despite their efforts, the android remained lifeless. "What happened on the isle?" one of the mages asked Nefarian. "Why isn't this android starting up?" Nefarian scowled, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know. But we have to get these androids working. The plan for conquest cannot be delayed any longer." Redbeard watched the mages for a few more minutes, taking in as much information as he could. Then, deciding that he had seen enough, he turned and made his way back to his shelter. He had a lot to think about, and he needed quickly to come up with a plan. Redbeard walked away from the mages, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. He had always known that the dark mages were dangerous, but he had never seen them working with the undead androids before. As he walked for a minute, he suddenly encountered again the android he had been following. The android turned its back to him, as if waiting for him. Redbeard noticed a small gadget embedded in the android's back, similar to the one the dark mages had been working on. He remembered how the mages had been trying to restart the android with the gadget, and wondered if he could do the same. As Redbeard turned the gadget, the android's body went limp and a final sigh of relief escaped its lips. The sound was quiet, but it carried with it a sense of peace and release. The android's body seemed to dissolve into the surrounding environment, as if it had finally found its true rest. As Redbeard watched the last android to leave the island, he heard the sounds of the mages preparing to depart. He knew that he had to act quickly if he wanted to catch a ride on the Zeppelin. With a surge of determination, he sprinted towards the ship, reaching out to grab the last rope hanging from the vessel just as it began to lift off the ground. He clung on tight, feeling the rush of the wind and the roar of the engines as the Zeppelin soared into the sky. As he climbed the frame of the Zeppelin, Redbeard could feel the ship beginning to lift off the ground. He knew he had to move quickly if he wanted to get on board. He reached the top of the envelope and carefully pulled himself over the edge, trying to stay out of sight of the dark mages. He lay on the top of the envelope, panting and sweating, as the ship soared into the air. From the top of the Zeppelin, Redbeard had a breathtaking view of the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a beautiful orange and pink hue. The water was calm and reflective, with gentle waves lapping against the sides of the ship. Redbeard could see for miles in every direction, with no land in sight. It was a truly awe-inspiring sight, and Redbeard couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and freedom as he took it all in. Despite the danger he was in, Redbeard couldn't help but feel a sense of peace and solitude as he watched the sunset from his perch atop the Zeppelin. Redbeard clung to the frame of the Zeppelin for several days, the cold air and rough seas battering him as the ship flew over the ocean. He knew he wouldn't have survived for long without the warmth of the envelope to keep him alive. Despite the discomfort and danger, he remained determined to reach his destination and bring Nefarian and the other dark mages to justice. Redbeard, still hanging onto the top of the Zeppelin, finally saw the shore in the distance. He knew he couldn't stay on the ship forever and decided to scuttle it by rupturing the envelope. He pulled out his makeshift knife, a piece of metal he had fashioned into a blade, and began to hack at the tough material. It took a lot of effort, but eventually he managed to create a small tear. He had expected the envelope to slowly deflate, but instead, there was a loud explosion. Redbeard was momentarily blinded by the flash of light and was thrown off the ship. He tumbled through the air, his ears ringing from the blast. When he finally hit the water, he was disoriented and struggling to catch his breath. It took all of his strength to swim towards shore, his clothes weighing him down. But he knew he had to keep moving, or he would surely drown. As he neared the shore, he could see the wreckage of the Zeppelin burning on the water's surface. Redbeard sat on the shore, panting heavily as he tried to catch his breath after the long swim. He looked around at the wreckage of the Zeppelin, scattered across the beach. The explosion had torn the ship apart, and there was no sign of any survivors. Redbeard couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. He had been prepared to fight any dark mages that may have made it to the shore, but it seemed that none of them had survived the crash. As he sat there, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin and the cool sand beneath him, Redbeard couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. He knew that no one would believe his tale of adventure and danger on the Isle of Undead Androids. He had faced down dark mages and android assassins, braved the depths of the beyond and the land of the dead, and had even survived a crash on a Zeppelin powered by dark magic. But to the rest of the world, he was just another crazy old pirate, spinning tall tales in the Rusty Anchor Tavern.